Okay, yeah, so thanks for that, Kevin. So just to introduce myself a bit more, I am a service user, history of dual diagnosis. I've been open to statutory mental health services for about 16 years and substance misuse services a bit longer than that. I had to think long and hard about what I was going to say today because a lot of what I'm going to talk about is about history, about how I've found it good, bad or indifferent to access mental health services alongside a substance misuse problem. And I wanted to maintain confidentiality as well through some of that and not really shock people. But so this is a piece of work that I co-produced with a forensic psychologist from the Norwich Centre, Jenny Sedgwick, who I've worked with before. I'll read you through, this is my kind of journey really. So the beginning of this, my journey was when I moved to Norfolk to escape a chaotic life of crime. I was a career criminal. I started to know that there was something wrong with me and the way that I lived my life, but I did not know what that was. I saw that my options for the future were prison or death. Many friends and associates were going down these paths. I asked the question, what was wrong with me and how could it be changed? I thought about what had happened to me in my childhood, growing up and in my adult years, and how it had shaped and affected me and those around me. I had no stable relationships and I moved around a lot. I moved to rural Norfolk about 18 years ago to escape that life of crime. And I changed my identity and started to engage with, tried to start to engage with services. I moved to rural Norfolk. I found somewhere to live and enrolled with a GP. I'd never had a GP before. I was 29 years old at the time. I was prescribed antidepressants and was put onto a waiting list to see a therapist at a GP surgery. The therapist was an inspiration to me. She was empowering, she listened and believed me, she treated me with dignity and respect. The therapist and a GP showed me kindness and compassion. These were elements that had been severely lacking in my life. I'd become a menace to society when I was growing up. The work that I did with a therapist was like lifting a weight off my shoulders. I found it enlightening and wanted to know more. It showed me that how I was because of the violence, abuse and chaos in my upbringing. It showed how I then abused substances and alcohol in order to self-medicate. When I first started self-medicating with substances, cannabis and alcohol, I was 10 years old. I did a lot of work with the therapists. Together we completed an assessment tool to measure PTSD. I scored quite highly on this. I remember it being sort of 18 out of 20. My life was still very chaotic, but the further I travelled from where I used to live, the sense of chaos lifted. It was not just about me moving away from my past, but it was empowering to live where no one knew me. Keeping my identity secret was a key part of my recovery. The burden of responsibility lifted. I severed all friendships and relationships to work on my future recovery, and I've had no contact from that day to this with those people. I had hope for the first time. I had hope and opportunity. I had lots of opportunities in the past, but they were wrong ones. I had choices in the past, but they were poor choices. My journey at this point, I decided to change my life for the better. I'd moved to Norfolk, engaged with a GP and a therapist, and for the first time this gave me insight, understanding and some control over my life. I was then referred to a psychologist. He diagnosed me with borderline personality disorder. I didn't really understand what was meant. I didn't understand this and what this diagnosis meant to me. It was a kind of back in the 90s, a really unhelpful diagnosis for people. Wasn't many services that existed in the treatment, and it was a kind of a fall through the cracks diagnosis. I was on a journey of discovery of who I am, what I want from life, and this brought up more questions than it did answers. I was then referred to a psychiatrist for an assessment. He told me that I had a diagnosis of PTSD and borderline personality disorder. Sorry, I told him that I had a diagnosis of PTSD and personality disorder. I don't think he knew what to do with me or how to take me seriously. I found this disempowering and dismissive. The psychologist told me that I could ask for a second opinion, but I felt unable to, as the psychiatrist was the lead professional in my life. And I felt that if I asked for a second opinion, it might somehow affect the care that was being delivered. My experience of services now became contradictory. The work that I'd done with the therapist and the psychologist was fantastic and rewarding, but just for the beginning. I found the psychiatrist overbearing. He did not listen, and I found him dismissive. He just dismissed all the hard work that had gone into meeting him prior to the assessment. He talked of my self-diagnosis, which this was not. I struggled to get access to services and to get the correct help. Part of this was not being taken seriously and feeling dismissed. I was told that I had to get help and alcohol-drug services, through alcohol-drug services such as Norcas, before being able to get any kind of psychological help through a statutory provider. It was hard practically, services were not spread out, I didn't drive, it was hard for me to get around, help was not forthcoming. At this point, no one had the whole picture. Services were disjointed and fragmented and incoherent. I was not being viewed as a whole person, but different parts of me. There were also different parts of the NHS concerned with my physical health and my mental health. Concerns raised by physical health teams were dismissed by mental health services. It seemed that the aim of services at that time was to repel all borders. The idea seemed to be that if you engaged with mental health services, you became reliant and dependent on them. So what changed? What made a difference? My diagnosis was challenged with the help and support of a voluntary sector organisation. I was able to challenge the diagnosis that I had. I asked to see a specialist from a mood disorder clinic, as I thought, and others did, that my mood needed to be stabilised. The referral was made. I met and was helped by the most inspirational people in the NHS and the voluntary sector. I got a life-changing diagnosis of bipolar and became, and because of this inspirational bipolar, and because of these inspirational people I'd met within the city locality, I had to make a decision about moving from North Norfolk into the city, as I needed access to better mental health provision. That was not available to me in the north, and it was an agonising decision for me because it meant that I had to leave my son and move away from him in order to access these services. I was able to focus on this and build around it. People are more than a diagnosis, but this can be contradictory, and a contradictory stance. People say that they don't want to label us and they don't want to stigmatise us, but other organisations and agencies in the country, such as benefit agencies, want to know what's wrong with you so that they can assess your need. Also, if I'm diagnosed with bipolar and I am not going to be treated with medication for diabetes, so I guess what I'm saying there is that the diagnosis is important. If you don't get the correct diagnosis, you don't know who you are. If you don't get the correct diagnosis, you don't get correct medication. So what is my message to you? The right diagnosis is important. Getting the right medication is important. Integration of different diagnoses, e.g. bipolar and chronic fatigue syndrome, have opposite symptoms. I remember being under the care of the chronic fatigue service at Lowestoft Hospital, who were very concerned about my mental health, and they wrote to mental health services saying that they were concerned about my mental health, only for a letter to be written back by my community mental health team to say that they should mind their own business and deal with my physical health care, and they specialise in my mental health. So there's something there about not treating people holistically. Adopt the principle that service users do have a good working and understanding of what's wrong with them. I think the psychiatrists that I worked with felt that I couldn't possibly have a better insight into my medical problems or my physical health problems than he did. And I think that there's too much of a power imbalance. The psychiatrist had too much power, not just over me, but over other professionals involved. Later on in my life, I went back to read my medical records, and in the psychiatrist's opinion, he'd expressed the view that I should be kept on full medication and full benefits for the rest of my life, as he did not think that I would achieve anything meaningful in my life. It took me 10 years to get the right diagnosis and medication. Services were fractured and chaotic, which left me with long periods of not engaging. Just one system worked. Just as one system worked, it got changed for another. There were lots of people around me who were trying to advocate and foster hope for me. And people were writing letters to this psychiatrist and saying, you know, can we try Kevin on antipsychotic medication? And his response to that was, no, I don't think it's going to help. It's not going to do anything. And I think what I needed at the time which I had was a strong advocate, people strongly advocating for me, and people holding on to hope and fostering that for me, because I didn't have it at the time. There was no recovery focus within the system, whereas I found one within the third sector. I found that individuals, NHS and voluntary sectors, who were an inspiration to me. The psychotherapy groups run by Amanda, and then the ones I attended in the city and the CAT groups run by Zoe and Steve were so recovery focused that they were really empowering and enabling. But as usual, you know, there wasn't enough of those groups to go around for everybody. I'm a strong believer in talking therapies. I learned a lot from the groups, the sort of things that you're supposed to learn from your parents and your grandparents. You know, I grew up with my parents not being around at all. And that's why I fell into gang culture at the age of 11, and not long after that into organised crime. I kind of had that label at school of being a problem child, not engaging. You know, I couldn't concentrate, and being at school was a release from not being at home and being in a really violent environment. So I learned so much from those groups, and I engaged in lots of personal development classes that were run by the WEA, you know, stuff on managing anger and anxiety and that kind of stuff, and I found that really beneficial as well. But what I never understood was that, because at one stage personal budgets came out of direct payments previously to that. And you've got to be pretty unwell to get access to personalisation. And I'm a strong advocate for social prescription. 5 years ago, when I did move into the city, I'd spent 10 years isolated in the rural Norfolk with no neighbours. And because it took 10 years to diagnose me with the correct medication, that meant another 10 years of chaos, not being able to hold down a job, you know, relationships not being successful, and that made me really angry. That made me really angry that I should have had to have suffered another 10 years of that. So I met the criteria of substantial critical needs to get access to this pot of money from social care, which meant that you could become an employer and you can buy in sort of domiciliary care, or you could buy in other kind of socially inclusive activities that would help. But I was too unwell, certainly far too unwell, to be an employer and manage a budget. And when I did move into the city, I found it, you know, it felt that I was even more socially isolated because everything was on my doorstep, but I was too unwell to access it. You know, I had agoraphobia, social phobia. You know, I wouldn't let people into my home, and you know, everything was on my doorstep but couldn't access it. And what worked really well for me was at the time, Voluntary Norfolk had a befriending scheme. And what I'd been doing with some of my payments was that, because at the time I didn't find the trust to be that recovery focused within mental health services, and I struggled around the dual diagnosis thing and getting access to a good service, that I bought a couple of hours in home treatment from Norwich Mind, and then gradually got out of the home. And you know, started to do the things that I used to enjoy doing, but you know, it was a slow process, but a successful one. But the point I'm making is that you know, I was able to meet the criteria of personalisation, but I wasn't able to meet the criteria of you know, an outreach team or assertive outreach. You know, I was really unwell. I never opted for hospital. When I came to Norfolk, I went through a 3-week home detox, and I did that by myself. So couldn't get access to services from a statutory provider, but got the service from the voluntary sector, and that was something that always confused me. But I mean, as a result of the excellent support that I did receive, partly from statutory and non-statutory organisations involved in my care, through personalisation, it's enabled me to work and build on my recovery. And you know, this has enabled me to give back to services and help, you know, the services that have helped me over many years. And I think that you know, recovery means a lot of different things to different people, but there's a kind of a national what's meant by recovery, and it says here, which is something. So what does recovery mean? In mental health, recovery means the process through which people find ways to live meaningful lives with or without ongoing symptoms of their condition. It's a personal journey of discovery that involves making sense and finding meaning in what has happened to us, becoming an expert in your own care, building a new sense of self and purpose, and discovering your own resourcefulness. And I think that's one thing that did teach me as a kid, was how to be resourceful at an early age. I had to grow up at a very early age. And you know, so I've been now living in the city for 5 years. What have I done with those 5 years? So I've become socially included. I'm still open to services, but I don't tend to use them that much. I still have Norwich Mind support me. Denise Grimes, who's the service manager of the Norfolk Recovery Partnership, but it was the Trust and Alcohol Drug Service at the time, approached me to join the commissioning team from NHS and the Trust, to be part of that group who would make a tender bid for the new service. So I was able to give back in that way, which meant I then became a board member of NRP. And I chaired the dual diagnosis group for the Norfolk Drug and Alcohol Action Team for quite a while. I'm now a service user governor and try and represent my constituents as best I can. But for me, for anybody around having recovery capital, which is kind of what we call it in substance misuse services, is about seeing different people at different stages of recovery and then asking the question of how they got there. About 3.5 years ago, I was approached by the Director of Operations and the CEO of the Foundation Trust, who'd been to a national conference and seen this presentation on IMROC. And IMROC is a national and international movement. It stands for Implementing Recovery Through Organisational Change. And through those changes, there's 10 key principles to those changes, and one of those is changing the nature of day-to-day involvement of service users. And it's very much about building a life beyond illness. It's very much about looking at what's in communities and asset mapping those communities. It's about not turning people into patients. It's about not parking people on prescriptions and leaving them just to wallow in society. It's about making people fight for their recovery. And there's been times where I've been really unwell, and I've been fortunate enough to have people foster that hope for me. And out of the whole IMROC process, we have peer support workers, so people with lived experience who are now working both within NRP and the Mental Health Trust. And being a peer lead for Norfolk has really helped me. So I spend sort of half my week embedded in the adult recovery team, working with the Foundation Trust there, and then I spend the other half of my week in an office in the medical school working with a guy called Tom Shakespeare, Dr. Tom Shakespeare, some people might know. And we're working in partnership, building an experts by experience faculty group, which is about bringing together staff, service users, carers, other organisations, and making sure that everything that the university does has service user and carer involvement in it, from admissions to module planning to interprofessional learning. And we're very passionate about that. And I guess until I got involved with this national IMROC stuff, I felt that the best that life had to offer me was medication, benefits. That's about it. I read that letter from that psychiatrist, and I thought, well, maybe he's right. I don't know. But I think what aids a person's recovery is they need a genuine and meaningful reason to get up in the morning. Just like anybody else, we need an identity. We need something to do. My something to do is giving something back. And who knew that I left school very early because I had a severe form of dyslexia, which I didn't discover until sort of like 2004. And that's not uncommon for people who, prisons are full of people with personality disorders or dyslexia or learning differences. So I guess, it's who knew that my lived experience would turn into kind of paid employment, and that, someone who left school with no qualifications would be an associate researcher and an associate lecturer at the UEA, using my lived experience to teach people. So I guess what I'm saying is that people can and do recover from drug misuse or addiction or whatever you want to call it. And people can and do recover from severe and enduring mental health problems. And people can be rehabilitated as well, I guess, from crime into I owe society a huge debt, which is what I'm trying to do by repaying by the work that I do with the Foundation Trust and other organisations. But that's kind of it really. So.